Okay, so I'm here from Dyslexia Sparks. We are a Hessel-based charity, and I'm going to be talking with you about dyslexia in the classroom, how it impacts your learners, and what you can do to support. Just very briefly, I'll start off by talking to you a little bit, just introduce myself so you know who I am and where I'm coming from in terms of this training. My name is Jane Craig, and I'm the founding director of our charity. My background is in psychology originally, and then I worked at the University of Hull as a lecturer for a number of years, teaching obviously much older learners in the business school. And then I came to the realization that it wasn't giving me the reward that I really wanted from teaching on that large scale teaching. And that's when I decided to retrain as a dyslexia specialist. And I've been specialising in dyslexia for a little bit over 12 years now. I am trained as a dyslexia teacher and also a dyslexia assessor. And I carry out those activities with our charity, as well as obviously training sessions like we're doing this evening, and alongside various other activities that we do as a charity that I'll give you a little bit of information about in a couple of slides' time. First thing I'd like to do this evening is just ask you a question, actually. So I want to find out a little bit from you guys about why we're doing the dyslexia training. So from your perspective, why is this important? No doubt you've got experiences within the classroom and things that you're hoping to get out of the training. So I'd like you to just take a couple of minutes thinking about that. And then what I'd like us to do is just share a couple of ideas around that with each other. Okay, so hopefully you've had a couple of minutes just to think about what the training what you're hoping to get out of this, why you feel it's important for you. And what I'd like you to do is just use the raise the hand icon on the Teams function to let me know you want to share an idea with us. Let us know what your thoughts are, and we can get a few ideas from a few people, hopefully. Yeah, Natasha?
Just to get further strategies to support children with dyslexia in classroom, really.
Yeah, super. Absolutely. And we'll definitely be covering some of that. Yeah. And then we've got Charlotte.
So for me, I'm the Senko at Bursar Academy. So it's gaining that understanding of those signs possibly within the learning that a child might have dyslexia. And then obviously we can support that through doing the screener and then again the strategies that we can use to support those children moving forward.
Yeah, okay, super. And we're definitely looking at building up knowledge and understanding of what dyslexia looks like in the classroom. So hopefully you will go away with, deeper knowledge of that, definitely, and then onto those support strategies. Yeah. Anything from anybody else that they would like to share? Okay, so we'll move on. And in terms of dyslexia training, what we're looking to cover is ways in which we might recognise dyslexic learners, which was mentioned, ways we can support learners to achieve at school. We also will touch upon something which I feel is really important, which is how we can help dyslexic learners to feel more confident. So often there's this, for a lot of dyslexic learners, there's difficulties around self-esteem and confidence in the classroom and at school, and that comes as a result of some of the challenges that they face. So we'll touch on some of that as well. Sometimes in terms of academic progress, it can be really hard to achieve that if a learner's not feeling that they're confident in it being able to make that progress or developing the learning. So it's important to get those things, give those things consideration as well. And we also potentially, might consider that this training will help you to equip dyslexic learners for their further education. So some of the things we'll talk about in terms of strategies are things that we would hope those learners will be able to sort of take on themselves as strategies, and therefore then be better equipped for when they move into secondary school and beyond, in terms of developing ways, understanding of the way they work, and some strategies to support some of that. And then the other thing I want to talk about is the fact that all of those things are things we will cover in this evening's session, and they're sort of, I'd say, fairly immediate needs for you in terms of right now these learners in school. But there's a couple of things I wanted to mention in terms of sort of putting that into the wider context. And there's been some really positive developments in the last few years in terms of thinking about dyslexia in a more positive light. And there is a lot of the things we'll talk about this evening, a lot of the activities we'll do are around recognising the barriers for dyslexic children. But as I say, there's been quite a push towards the positive view of dyslexia. And so 2022 was a really important year with that in mind, when dyslexic thinking was added to the dictionary as a specific way of problem solving. And this has got quite a lot of backing from a national charity called Made by Dyslexia, who do lots of really great work on seeing the positives of dyslexia. And they've got lots of showcasing strengths and success stories that they do. It was also quite heavily backed by the Virgin Company, because Richard Branson is one of their ambassadors, very famously dyslexic and very open about the challenges he faces, but also what he sees strengths that dyslexia has brought to him in terms of his idea generation, problem solving approach, and obviously his success in the business world. So that's quite a different way of thinking about dyslexia for a lot of people. It's not to suggest that all dyslexic people will be the most incredible problem solvers. That isn't necessarily true in my experience, but it is the kind of typical profile of a dyslexic person, is that they will be better at that type of problem solving than perhaps they are at the typical school-based, more academic type learning, such as the literacy subjects and the less creative problem solving subjects. And alongside that, dyslexic thinking was also added to LinkedIn as a skill which individuals can select that they have, and that which organisations are actively looking for in terms of when they're employing new people. And given that the sort of state the world is in at the moment in terms of the economy and all the other problems we've got going on, it seems to me definitely that that's something we really need. We need people who can think in different ways and come up with new ideas to solve some of these big problems we've got going on. So as I say, a lot of what we do this evening, we will be exploring the challenges for dyslexic learners and how we can support that directly within the classroom. But I just would like you to keep in mind this bigger picture in terms of this is the future potentially for these dyslexic individuals. Dyslexic thinking is something we want to be able to foster for them within the classroom and beyond. Okay, and then I'm just going to give you a little bit of information about who our charity is. So that you've got some information, partly so you understand, again, sort of where I'm coming from with the training, what our ethos is, what our vision is as a charity, but also so that you've got some information in case you're being asked questions from parents. And there's lots of things we do to support parents, so you can refer on or recommend us to them so they can get more information and guidance. So at Dyslexia Sparks, we enable and inspire dyslexic individuals of all ages to overcome barriers to success and to reach their potential. And we do that by providing specialist assessments, individualised tuition, training and guidance. So a note there that I've mentioned that we support dyslexic individuals of all ages. So it's not just children and young people, it is adults as well. We've got some really key contracts with big local organisations who we offer assessments for. And we also do training with organisations, as well as supporting adults privately. So adults who come to us off their own back wanting an assessment or guidance for themselves. We also, as I mentioned, do lots of things for parents to support. So we have a monthly support session that happens online mostly. And that allows people to access that from anywhere across the region and beyond. It also often gets attended by teachers as well, because we have a range of topics being talked about on there. Lots of different things coming up. If you want to explore that, the information is on our website as well as our social media pages. And what we ask people to do is sign up and receive free tickets via Ticket Tailor. And if they can't attend that session live, then they're able to they'll be sent a recording of the session to watch it in their leisure at a different time. And our vision as a charity is for a world where dyslexic individuals are valued and celebrated for what they have to offer. So whether that's in school or whether it's in the wider community, whether it's in the world of work, we want them to understand what their strengths are and feel that they can have a contribution to that world around them. As a charity, our services are charged at a subsidised rate, or a number of them are free. And so that means that although things like assessments and tuition do carry a fee, it's much lower than it typically would be if you went somewhere else for an assessment, for example, or specialist tuition. And we also, as a charity, have bursary funding available for those lower income families to support the costs of assessments and tuition. So as I say, that's just a bit of information to help you understand generally what we have on offer as a charity and what things you might recommend to parents, as well as potentially access yourself if you want some more guidance after today. All right, so in terms of today's session, what we're going to be looking at is what dyslexia is and how it might affect students within school, and how we can ensure dyslexic students are supported in the classroom. And it is about developing understanding and your knowledge, but it's also, I hope, going to give you a chance to build your empathy with dyslexic learners, allow you to begin to think about how you might adapt or improve on what you're already doing. And so it's not just about me saying to you, right, these are the ways you should support, you've got to do X, Y, and Z. The idea is that through the activities we do to help us understand what dyslexia is, you will begin to reflect on things that you do already at the moment. And as I say, whether those things are helping or whether they might be hindering in terms of dyslexic learners, and how we can tweak and develop and build on those things. And the other thing I would say is that in terms of supporting dyslexic learners, a lot of what I'll talk about are things that you can actually do as a whole class, because I recognise that for teachers it's very difficult often to find additional time to support those that need separate help. I will talk about some of those things you might do to adapt for certain students, but a lot of the strategies we'll talk about are things that we can do with a whole class, which will absolutely help the dyslexic learners and will certainly not hinder the non-dyslexic learners as well. And the chances are you've got a range of students in your classes in terms of neurodiversity. So there's some of these strategies we'll talk about will be helpful across other learning differences as well. So for example, things like attention concentration difficulties, it sort of goes across dyslexia as well as ADHD and so on. So there's things that we'll touch on that will be helpful for a lot of students, I hope. All right, so what I'm going to do to begin with is talk about what dyslexia is, and I want to just give you a brief introduction to that word dyslexia and its definition. And it has been around for a long time in terms of the word, but we often get comments, particularly when we do events in the community, about the word dyslexia and the fact that it's quite a complicated word to read and spell. And a lot of people will ask us, why is it called dyslexia when I, as a dyslexic person, have difficulties with reading and spelling? It kind of seems a bit unfair. So we like to explain where that word comes from, and that helps to build that understanding, and also that putting that into the context that it does come from somewhere. It's not just a made-up word to make things tricky for dyslexic people. So the word dyslexia comes from the Greek language. The dys part means difficulty and the lexis part means language. So at its very core, dyslexia is a difficulty with words and language, and that was what the early definition was, dyslexia, and what it was understood as originally. Now, obviously, over time, there's been lots of research into dyslexia to understand more about what it is and how it occurs, why certain people are dyslexic and other people are not, and what constitutes dyslexia in more detail. And in 2016, we received the first agreed definition in the UK of what dyslexia is. And this came about on the back of a report which was produced by Sir Jim Rose, the former head of Ofsted, who did an investigation into schools and learning, and as part of that looked at the definition of dyslexia. And the definition at that time was a little bit longer than this, but in its essence, the key points were that dyslexia was agreed to be identifiable as a developmental difficulty. So what that means is it develops in the brain from birth. It's not something that would suddenly occur in later life, for example. It's to do with brain differences, so therefore it's always present. And it's about language learning and cognition. So we've still got the recognition that it is about words and language, but we've got the formal recognition that dyslexia is about processes within the brain, the cognition of the brain, and we've got an acceptance that that's a big part of dyslexia. That primarily affects the skills involved in accurate and fluent word reading and spelling. So now we've got the formal recognition that it does impact somehow in literacy, and particularly that accuracy with word reading and the fluency, so fluency, speed of reading as well as spelling. And then very recently, towards the end of 2024, going into 2025, we actually had an update to the definition. And this is called the Delphi definition. And this was quite different in terms of how this was developed. So what happened here was that the research study brought together just short of 60 international experts in dyslexia, which included academics, specialist teachers, educational psychologists, but also individuals with dyslexia, to vote on whether they agreed about several key statements about dyslexia. So they were given this really long list of statements and they were asked, do you agree? Is this something that it should be included as a part of dyslexia? Is this true of a dyslexic person? And really the purpose of that was to develop the assessment side of dyslexia. So at its core, this hasn't changed what we know about dyslexia. It doesn't mean that what was reported in the Rose report is not accurate anymore, and it doesn't mean that most of what you probably know about dyslexia at a basic level, it doesn't mean that that's not true, but it's developed it with more detail to allow the assessment of dyslexia to be more accurate and to be more certain in terms of identifying dyslexia. So what that research study came up with was a number of statements, and you can see them on the screen now, but you can see there's a lot there and there's a lot of detail. And as I say, doesn't mean you don't need to necessarily read all of that and understand all of that, because it's about really that detail, level of detail. It really is for those individuals who are assessing for dyslexia. But what I will do now is just briefly talk you through the core features of that, the key points that have come out of that Delphi definition, so that you're up to speed. So dyslexia underneath the Delphi definition is defined as a set of processing difficulties affecting reading and spelling. So as I say, that hasn't really changed, but there's some more detail added to that within the new definition. And we would expect in a dyslexic person for literacy skills to be weaker than their age, their level of education, or another level of attainment, depending on their circumstances. And the key features of dyslexia are still that we would expect there to be reading fluency and spelling difficulties. There's a recognition that dyslexia does exist on a continuum, meaning that how significant or severe it is for somebody might vary compared to somebody else. However, what I would say is important to be aware of is that this is not something that we report on in a dyslexia assessment. That's not what we're advised to do. So what we mean by this really is that it will vary because it depends on how significant those cognitive processing weaknesses are for different people, but it isn't something that you would see anymore in a report, whereas you would have potentially seen that a few years ago. So you might have seen somebody diagnosed, identified as mildly dyslexic, moderately, severely, very severely, and so on, but that is now not advised in terms of report writing, and so you won't see that written, although it is recognised that people will vary. And there's a recognition within the current definition that dyslexia is influenced by genetics and also the environment. So what we mean by that is that often there's some sort of genetic link. We might not always know what that is because the generation of parents or grandparents, it may not have been formally identified, but somewhere within the family, we would expect there would be dyslexia present. And then also the fact that it's potentially impacted by the environment that that person has experienced. So what we mean by that is that it's not about whether somebody is or isn't dyslexic in terms of their environment. But for example, if we have a young person who was identified with dyslexia at the earliest opportunity and then received lots of very specialist and effective intervention to support them with their literacy skills, we would be less likely to see weaknesses with literacy than we would if we were to meet somebody who hadn't had those differences identified early on and hadn't had that access to that support. So as I say, it's not that their dyslexia would be there or would be present or not, depending on the environment, but it may be that how that presents in terms of where their skills sit might be different. We also might see some differences in some of the cognitive processing features depending on the intervention support they've received. And I'll talk about that a little bit later on in terms of how we can impact that. We also might see some impacts from the environment in terms of things like regular reading. So if that young person grows up in a household where there isn't much regular reading going on, and sometimes that can be influenced by the parents' reading skills. So if we've got a dyslexic parent who therefore finds reading hard and doesn't enjoy reading or is reluctant to read, they may be less likely to read with their child. Then again, we'd probably see some impact on literacy skills as compared to another person whose parent is very insistent and supportive in terms of making sure reading is happening regularly. We would imagine that their reading skills may be better developed than somebody who's not doing reading as often, although that doesn't always translate depending on their challenges. And in terms of the cognitive features of dyslexia, there now is a real recognition that dyslexia is to do with phonological processing. And there's lots of things that make up phonological processing that we're going to have a look at as we go through this evening. But that would be something we'd be very much looking for in terms of being able to identify dyslexia. This definition also recognises that there may be an impact beyond literacy in terms of dyslexia. So beyond reading fluency and accuracy, we might well see difficulties with reading comprehension. And that's quite common. And we'll see later on, we're going to do a reading activity where you'll get a bit of an understanding of why that's happening. We also might, for example, see difficulties with maths. Now, quite often, dyslexic individuals are much stronger with maths, but not always. And often dyslexic individuals will tell us that that's because maths is much more black and white and it's not as confusing, as complex as English, the language of English. But sometimes dyslexic individuals may have difficulties with maths due to, for example, challenges with short-term and working memory, which is often a key feature of a dyslexic profile. And they may have difficulties with maths due to the language of maths. So it might be, and it quite often is the case, that when it comes on to them working with worded maths questions, that's when they start to struggle. Or it could be that they get confused about the language of maths in terms of different terms used for the same processes. So for example, for adding, I can't remember off the top of my head, but there's a really high number of words that can be used for that. So you've got add, total, sum, and lots of others, and that can be confusing potentially for a dyslexic person. And we also might see challenges with things like learning another language, which is very common, or other skills. And sometimes that goes beyond the classroom. So we might see if a dyslexic child has difficulties with following instructions, which is very common, that might extend to, for example, taking part in a sport, following instructions on a rugby pitch, where there's lots of things going on and there's lots of external noises can make it hard for them. So it doesn't just have to be within the literacy world. And the definition now also recognises that co-occurring conditions might be present alongside dyslexia. And that I wouldn't think is anything new to you guys. I would think that that's something that you're aware of, but the new definition formally recognises that now. ADHD is believed to be the most commonly overlapping with dyslexia, but we've also got things like developmental language disorder or dyspraxia and dyscalculia that might also overlap. So as I say, that's the sort of definition at a glance to some extent, and that's the sort of key features that we would see in that definition now, and we'd be working towards in terms of looking to assess for dyslexia and identify dyslexia. Okay, so next thing I want to do is just move on a little bit and talk about how the dyslexic brain is thought to differ. So the development of brain scanning has given us quite a lot of insight into how the dyslexic brain functions differently from a non-dyslexic brain. And because people with dyslexia are born with a dyslexic brain rather than it developing over time or suddenly developing in later life, understanding the differences in the brain function can help us to understand and provide for children from the moment that dyslexia is suspected. And so the image that you're seeing on the screen is thought to represent a dyslexic brain. It's one person's interpretation. What we've got on the right-hand side, you can see lots of colour, lots of people sort of sitting around thinking up ideas, doing creative outside practical activities. And on the left side, we can see a much more unified, systemised storage process going on. So if we take the example of reading, the brain scans suggest that from at an early age, when children learn to read, they begin by using both sides of the brain. And then a non-dyslexic brain tends to start to use the left side of the brain more dominantly for reading skills. So the suggestion is that what that means is that that information about reading is being stored and categorized in quite a linear, systemized way, which makes it easier to access and retrieve when we need it. So a non-dyslexic learner can come across an unknown word, for example, can quickly in their long-term memory find the information they need to break that word down. Or when they come across some high frequency common words, they can very quickly remember what that word is, recognize that word. In a dyslexic brain, the scans suggest that as they continue with reading, they don't move over to that left side in terms of relying on that for developing the reading skills, but actually they continue to use both sides of the brain. And what that means, the suggestion is that what that means is that that information isn't stored as systematically, it's not categorized in the same ways. And so what that can lead to is difficulties with retrieving that information at speed or being accurate with retrieving that information. So it might be that it is in there somewhere in the long-term memory, but dyslexic individuals find it hard to get it back out. Or it could be that it hasn't been stored within the long-term memory at all. It hasn't made it from the short-term to the long-term memory. So they've got some gaps in that knowledge. And then what we've got here is a couple of images which sort of go alongside that in terms of recognising maybe how a dyslexic brain is different. So we've got one from a book called The Illustrated Dyslexia and Illustrated Guide to Dyslexia and Its Amazing People. And this image says that dyslexic thinking is like a pinball machine. So it bounces around and leads to some winning ideas like the jackpot image we can see on there. And in this second image, we've got a picture drawn by a 10-year-old girl in a book called Dyslexia is My Superpower. And I recognise the detail is a little bit hard sometimes to see on this, but what she's saying is that in the dyslexic brain, which is the person on the right, they take the winding road, which takes longer, but she gets more ideas that way. And in her view, the non-dyslexic brain is quicker. That person is quicker from getting from A to B, but they don't get as many ideas along the way. So it's much more of a sort of linear, straightforward process. And what we might take from that is that perhaps that means that sometimes we need to teach in a different way for dyslexic learners to allow them that fluidity, that curiosity, that ability to find those ideas and showcase those strengths. But we also, I would suggest, we might need to do more in terms of helping them to learn how to work in that more structured linear way, which is quite typical within the classrooms. So lots of what we do within the school day is structured and goes, in quite a step-by-step manner. So it may be that we need to support that in terms of recognising that that dyslexic person, that may not be something that comes naturally to them. They may need a little bit more support in terms of developing that skill to work in that way. Okay, so what I'm going to go on and move on and talk about now is the 4 aspects of cognitive processing, those processes within the brain that are considered to be key aspects of a dyslexic profile. So I'm going to briefly introduce them now, but then we're going to go on and talk about each of these in more detail. So first of all, we've got phonological awareness, which is all about making sense of sounds in words. And I'll give you some examples in a minute. We'll do a couple of activities to see what that means in more detail. We also would be looking at whether there might be difficulties with phonological memory. So this is still to do with sounds, but now it's about being able to hold on to sounds in the short term and working memory and use them for skills like, for example, blending sounds together for reading. We would also be looking at, is there difficulties with auditory, short-term and working memory? So that's the listening memory, holding on to and manipulating verbal information that comes in verbally. And finally, we would be looking at, are there difficulties with speed of processing? So this is a basic measure of how quickly someone can take in new learning, new information, prepare ideas and respond to questions, whether that's verbally or in writing. Now, a dyslexic profile, as I mentioned earlier on, will vary between person to person. So not all dyslexic individuals necessarily will have difficulties across all of these areas to the same degree. In order to identify dyslexia, we'd be looking at, is there difficulties across at least some of these areas? And can we see an impact on literacy skills? You might have an individual who has difficulties across maybe sort of 3 of these or some specific aspects of some of these to a sort of fairly minor degree. They might have some sort of low or below average scores in some of these areas. And then you might have at the other extreme a learner who has difficulties across all 4 of these areas, and their difficulties might be much more pronounced. So they might have well below average scores in all of these aspects. And therefore for them, dyslexia is probably going to impact them much more heavily than it might the person with slightly less significant difficulties in some of these areas. And that's part of the reason that we can help to identify dyslexic learners in the classroom. We can start to spot some of these signs, but it doesn't mean that all dyslexic learners necessarily need exactly the same support. So it's about understanding what their individual needs are, as well as doing things on a whole class level that will support them generally. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is move on and talk about these things in a bit more detail. So first of all, phonological awareness is about identifying sounds, blending sounds and manipulating sounds. And this is the brain's ability to do this. So when we assess this within a dyslexia assessment, we're doing lots of listening word games and getting the person to respond according to the different activities to identify how well developed their brain is at doing these different skills in terms of phonological awareness. And difficulties with phonological awareness will impact in various ways. Some of these will be more obvious than others. So it will typically impact on learning phonics. It will also often impact on using phonics for reading, using phonics for spelling. Now, it also might impact on processing verbal instructions, which is potentially less obvious, but verbal instructions are made up of words which are made up of sounds. So it could be that there's some impact there as well if somebody has difficulties with phonological awareness. And it also might impact in terms of spelling during writing. And we quite often meet parents who tell us that their child can learn the spellings that they're given, for example, for a weekly spelling test. They can learn them for the test. They do rote learning. They practice, and then they do okay in the test. But then those things are forgotten. Those spellings are forgotten, quite quickly forgotten. And that might be because they're not actually understanding the phonics rules around those words. They're just simply rote learning them or remembering the visual pattern of the letters. But also what sometimes happens is that spelling diminishes during writing because there's so many other things to think about that the child then starts to forget the sounds and so on while they're writing because they're thinking about all the different aspects of writing. And we'll do a writing activity a bit later on to give you a bit of an awareness of why that's happening and how it might play out. Now, bear in mind as well that phonological awareness is not just about an awareness of individual sounds or groups of sounds. It does also include other skills, so things like sentence segmentation or rhythm and rhyme. And phonological awareness progresses from easy skills to much harder skills. So at the top there of this image, you can see phonemic awareness, which is considered to be the most challenging skill. And that is awareness of those individual sounds or groups of sounds. But before that, we've got lots of things that need to be developed. So we're going down right to the early years with the listening skills, for example. And then along the way, we've got different skills that need to be developed. And quite often we find that even with older learners, for example, their rhyming ability might be really quite poor. And it may be that they really struggled with that when they were younger, but there wasn't enough sort of extra time to go over it or wasn't done in different ways that they could learn that. And that is likely to be a barrier to them developing those individual phonemic awareness skills. So if you've got learners who are working on phonics, struggling with phonics, and are repeating phonics programs over and over again, maybe sometimes without much success, as sometimes happens, it may be that you need to review some of these earlier skills because it could be that they've got some gaps earlier on, which are preventing them from developing those phonics skills at the top level. Now, obviously, to do that, you would need to do that generally outside of the classroom and an intervention of some sort. And I would just say, obviously, be careful if you're doing that. We're not using the same materials we would at the younger age that they're originally designed for. We'd need to be looking at adapting, developing some materials or getting some materials online to help with things like rhyming skills that are more appropriate to their age if they're an older learner. But this is also the reason why we can potentially begin to think about, or at least have on our radar, learners who might be dyslexic even in the much younger years. So if they're struggling with rhyme and alliteration, you see that at a young age, or sentence segmentation or awareness of syllables, it could be that they're the ones you start to consider, okay, they might be ones we'd sort of keep an eye out for as potentially being dyslexic as they progress through their learning. Okay, we're going to do a quick activity now to just have a go at a phonological awareness activity exercise. And this is designed to help you have a little bit of an insight into what we mean by phonological awareness and see how you get on with it, how easy you find it, how hard you find it. So what I want you to do is repeat after me. And I want you to repeat after me, sprand. Now say sprand without saying duh. Now say sprand without saying s. Now say sprand without saying mm. Now say sprand without saying p. Now say sprand without saying r. And what you'll probably find as we've gone through that, potentially, is that some of those are more difficult than others, okay? So did you find it easy? Did you find it hard? Were there any strategies being employed? Anyone happy to share their thoughts on that, how they got on? Was there any strategies you were using? Was there certain sounds you found harder than others? Either pop your hand up or just unmute yourself and feel free to share. Okay, so nobody's given me any feedback. I have to assume that you all found it super easy. But normally people do vary in terms of their ability to accurately and efficiently process sounds. So some people will have found some of those sounds harder than others. Typically, the beginning and end sounds are easier to remove. That anything more towards the middle is a more challenging skill in terms of phonological awareness. And we've also, within that non-word that I gave you, and I gave you a non-word to make it a bit more challenging, a word that you're not as familiar with, we had quite a complex group of sounds, multiple sounds. So in the spr part at the beginning, we've got 3 sounds that are all very close together. So that can be much more difficult as well. And some people will have needed more time for that than others. If you were doing this all together in a room, you probably would have heard people responding at slightly different times. Some people feeling they needed, more time than others. And what then can sometimes happen is people start to think, oh, hang on, why are they saying it for me? Why can't I do it at the same speed? And that's often what happens with dyslexic learners. They feel they need more time to process this sort of activity, and therefore they start to notice that they're taking longer than others, and that can then have an impact on them in terms of maybe their self-worth, their feelings of self-confidence. Typically, dyslexic learners will find this sort of skill very difficult. Sometimes they might use strategies to support that, and you may have been doing that yourself. So often people tell me that they're using visualization to support, so they can picture that non-word in their head, and then they can remove each letter at a time to see what they're left with. And if we notice this, dyslexic learners or the learners we work with doing that when we're doing an assessment to look at phonological awareness, that would be really important, because it tells us that although they might be able to do it, they're using a visual strategy to support, which means that they're probably trying to overcome that auditory processing difficulty in terms of the sounds, and that's important to be aware of. Okay, so moving on, phonological memory is about our ability to hold on to sounds in the short term and working memory. Phonological memory is temporary, so it only works over a few seconds to keep track of that phonological information. And it might lead to difficulties with things like forgetting a sound. So for example, you might see a child sound out a word at the individual letter level and accurately, but then when they come to put it back together, a sound is missing. It seems to have been forgotten. Or it could be that they mix up the order of sounds. And this often happens during spelling as well. So again, you might see a child sound out a word accurately for spelling. They might be doing it under their breath or out loud. Then when they come to write it down, the letters are there, the sounds are there, but they're not in the right order. So their memory is trying to hold on to it without being able to see it. Physically, it's not there. It's just being held in the memory, and things get a little bit muddled up sometimes. We might also see a dyslexic individual replacing a sound with an incorrect sound when they're trying to blend them together for reading or spelling, or completely forgetting all the sounds. And it might also be that they just can't get to that stage of blending them. So I worked with a young learner recently who was reading nonsense words, and she sounded out each one at the individual letter level, but then just didn't blend them back together at all. So she just couldn't get to that stage. It was too much load for her phonological memory. She just couldn't keep track of it. Too much processing for her to do. Okay, so we're going to do a quick activity now where we look at what it might be like converting sounds to letters for a dyslexic reader. And we're going to have a go at an activity, and then I'm going to ask for some feedback. And if people aren't happy to speak out loud, then perhaps we can use the chat function, because it'd be really great to get a bit of idea sharing, opinion sharing between you, so you can bounce off each other in terms of the learning as well. So first of all, what I'm going to show you is some letters from the Greek alphabet and the sounds in our language that they correspond to. And you're just going to get a few seconds to look at these and try and learn them with no writing down, and then I'll show you a second set. Okay, so that was your first set, and here's your next set. And what I'm going to do now is show you a word with those Greek letters, and I want you to have a go at reading it, and then be prepared to pop me some feedback in the chat, or give me some ideas out loud. Okay, so that's the word. Let's get some feedback on how we've done. As I say, if you'd rather type some feedback in the chat, that's fine. Oh, we've got somebody having a guess at the word. What's the second word? Chips, somebody said. Could be. Let's see what other guesses we get or attempts we get. A few people typing, but the messages aren't showing up yet. So I'm just waiting until they are, and then I can share them with everybody. And remember, you can give me your feedback as well. It's not just about guessing the word, but you can give me your feedback in terms of how you got on with that, how you found it. Okay, so somebody's mentioned remembering a specific letter, the X, as ch, because it was the last letter shared, and some as though those like T, as this looks similar, same as those like T, as this looks similar. So yeah, so you've sort of used a variety of strategies there, which is interesting, isn't it? We maybe remember the last thing we saw more easily, and that is quite common. Or it might be that visually we've made some sort of connection. Okay, so somebody else has shared, Lucy said she was couldn't process the Greek letters, just not enough time. And you are dyslexic, so that will have been challenging, yes. And the idea with some of these activities is to make them extra challenging for those who are not dyslexic, so they can see what it feels like. So I can imagine that would have been hard. I did give you very little time to make it extra challenging, and I certainly would expect, most people would need more time to learn that. We may have had some other strategies going on. So sometimes, and I'll just show you the word that we had again. Sometimes people recognize the P in the word, this one here. Let's go back, because it's the pi symbol. So sometimes people make that connection, and that can be really helpful with memory, is making associations with things that we already know. So that can often help. But as somebody else mentioned, there was a couple of other things going on. Sometimes the last thing we remember, for some people, it's the first. That can be the most memorable. And then, yes, we had the challenge of time and lots of information being thrown at you in a short space of time. So the word that we actually were shown was the word chips. But as I say, we would probably have needed quite a bit more time to learn that. We maybe, as one person mentioned, would have had to have it written down in front of us to be able to look at and go back to, rather than just being displayed quickly for a few seconds. So we were challenging your phonological awareness there in terms of making new links with sounds, but also your phonological memory, holding on to that information for a short space of time and being able to use it for reading. So that's a little bit of a demonstration, sort of an insight into how it might be in terms of trying to make links between letters and sounds for a dyslexic learner. So we're going to move on now and talk a little bit more about memory, but I just want to outline, before we go into this next section, sort of different aspects of memory that can be considered, and how these relate to dyslexia. So the first three that we've got there, we've got auditory, verbal, short-term memory, phonological memory, and working memory. And those are all things that typically we would expect will probably be difficulties for a dyslexic learner. So we've talked a bit about phonological memory, and in a minute we'll talk a bit more about short-term and working memory. Now, visual memory and long-term memory are not things that we would typically expect to be difficulties in a dyslexic learner, and quite often are relative strengths for them. So quite often dyslexic learners are better at remembering things visually, and that can be something they use to help compensate. So it might be that they recognise, as I mentioned earlier, the visual shapes of the words for spelling, for example. And particularly when we work with older learners or adults, we often get them telling us that they need to write the word down in a couple of different ways and see how it looks to know if it's spelled correctly, to know if it's the right spelling, because they're trying to overcome that difficulty with remembering the sounds and the pattern of the letters, and they're using the visual memory, the shape of the word, to help them instead. And often we would find that dyslexic learners' long-term memory is better than their short-term memory, and often can be a relative strength. So they quite typically will be able to tell us all sorts of details about maybe where they went on holiday this year, or an interest that they've been into for a long time, all the details of a computer game that they play a lot, for example, but then would find it difficult to remember something they did in a lesson just the day before. So quite some big differences potentially for them there. And The challenge often is getting information from the short term into the long term memory, but also getting it back out. And that's what I'll talk to you about in terms of some of these strategies, is how we can support with that, how we can improve on that for dyslexic learners. So in terms of short-term and working memory, what we are talking about is the temporary memory storage, which helps us to learn new information, follow instructions, and stay focused in our learning as well. So if we've got difficulties with short-term and working memory, we quite often will see a child asking the same questions. I spoke to a teacher recently who said that they would give a verbal instruction and their learner would need to ask that to be repeated sometimes up to 5 times. So definitely a challenge with holding on to that information temporarily and recalling it. And there's lots of things we can do to support with that I'll talk to you about later on. We often will see learners finding it hard to remember all of something that was taught previously or part of what was previously taught. And notice here, I've said learn information. It could be that it was taught but not learned. So it was the teacher gave the information, but doesn't mean that the child's learned it. Or it could be that they did appear to learn it, they understood it, but they can't access it from their long-term memory for whatever reason. Often difficulties with short-term memory will make it hard for a child to know what they're meant to be doing. So they might not start doing the work when everyone else does. Some children might just, as I'm sure you've seen, sit still and look a bit helpless and not do anything at all. Others might, as in the example I just gave a few minutes ago, might ask for instructions to be repeated from the teacher. Other learners might turn to their friend to ask what they're meant to be doing or to ask for help. And that is quite typical reaction when we're struggling, is to turn to somebody that we trust and ask for help. Now, depending on your classroom environment, your expectations, that may or may not be something that you sort of expect or allow in the classroom. Sometimes it's seen as children, not following the rules because they've been asked to work quietly, for example. But it's just important, I would say, to check out why a child isn't working or why they're asking questions around them. If that's what's happening, is it because they don't understand what they're meant to be doing or they've forgotten the instructions? And if so, how can we support with that and allow them to be more independent in their learning? We often, because of short-term and working memory difficulties, will see spelling mistakes during writing. And I mentioned that earlier in terms of phonological awareness and phonological memory, but it often is linked to general memory difficulties as well. And as I said, we will do a writing activity in a short while where you'll get to see sort of why that's happening and understand that in a bit more detail. And memory difficulties will often lead to challenges with remembering what's been read for various reasons. So it could be because a child has stopped to try and decode an unknown word. They're holding on in their working memory. They're trying to hold on to what they've already read and remember it. But if they've got working memory difficulties, they might start to struggle with that and things get forgotten. So by the time they've finished decoding that word that they weren't sure about, the rest of what they've read has gone out of their mind. Okay, so we're going to do a quick memory activity now and see how you get on with your memory skills. First of all, I want you to have a go at memorising a list. And you'll just have a few seconds to have a look at this list. And at this stage, I don't want you to do any writing down. We're just going to try and remember it in our own way. So here it is. Okay, now what I want you to do is I want you to check the spellings on this list of words, and I want you to write down on your handout or on your notepad in front of you any corrections that need to be made. And then in a minute, when we've had a chance to look through that, I'll ask for some feedback from that. So just want you to write down which of those words are spelled incorrectly and write their correct spellings in front of you. Okay, so hopefully you've all had a chance to work through them. If what I would like you to do now is just tell me, you can do it via the chat or via your microphone, which ones need to be corrected. And I suggest if you're typing that, just give me one at a time to give different people a chance to be involved, give their comments. What have we got that's spelled incorrectly? Okay, we've got ham as corrected with one M rather than two M's. Brilliant, well spotted. Somebody else has noticed cracker was wrong, and so we've now got it as C-R-A-C-K-E-R. It was missing that second C. Brilliant. And somebody else has got broccoli. Well done. That often causes a bit of disagreement as to whether it should have two C's or two L's or both. But we've got that correctly added as two C's, one L. Well done. I think we should have at least one more. Let's have a look. Somebody spotted it. Somebody added 3 there, including yogurt, which I think is our missing one. Yep. So yogurt should have a H after the G. Sometimes doesn't, and that's the Americanized spelling, I think. If you've got that, we'll give you that as a point. And it doesn't need the I after the Y. So well done. Brilliant. So we've spotted those spellings, we've corrected them, and what I want you to do now is I want you to write down what you can remember from the shopping list that I gave you. And I'll give you a couple of minutes to do that. Okay, hopefully you've all had enough time to get down what you can from that. Oh, I can see people adding comments to the chat. This is maybe giving things away to other people. Okay, so we've got a few things on there. So all together, let me show you what we had on the list, and you can check your responses for yourself. We had 7 items. And sometimes people ask me how many did we have, which is a really good question because it often is very helpful to know how many things we're trying to remember to help us remember them. It's a great strategy for memory. So that's the list, and you can obviously have a look at how you got on. Any comments on that? Any feedback? What did we find? How did we find it? Did we find it easy, difficult? Anything that made it trickier, do you think? Okay, so Natasha has shared her strategy. That's great. You paired up the food types to remember them. So you put them together in terms of what sort of went together. Yeah, that's quite a common one that here. So that's a really good strategy. Any other strategies people want to share? What helped them? Okay, can't see any other strategies being shared on there, so I should just go through a few that you might have used and talk about some of these. Just bear in mind that this was designed to be made more difficult by the proofreading task, the spell check task that you did. That was designed to interrupt your short-term memory. So rather than you just being able to hold on to that information alone for a few seconds, you were being asked to do something else. So I was interrupting your flow there with the memory and forcing you to use your working memory to keep track of more than one piece of information, two groups of information. And that was made probably more difficult by the fact that they were both lists of foods. So because the topic was similar, it will make it potentially a little bit confusing. And that may have led to some challenges for people getting mixed up between the lists or made it harder to keep track of those lists of information. So in terms of strategies, some of you will have potentially used repetition, which is quite a common strategy. I would say one of the most common that people tend to use if they're going to try and remember something is simply repeating it in their head over and over, or maybe out loud, as a way of remembering it. Some people use visualization. So people often feed back to me that they might be able to see the food items on their plate, for example, or they can see them in the supermarket. They're visualizing them somehow as a way of remembering them. Often people group or chunk the items. So that was mentioned as a strategy on the chat, that somebody groups them together according to what things sort of went together. You also might use a strategy of simply separating the information into groups. So there we had 7 pieces of information. You might have put 4 in one group, 3 in another, in order to separate them and make it easier to remember them. And that is actually what the research tells us is quite akin to what is happening with the memory, really, when we try and remember stuff. So the research evidence suggests that as an adult, typical number of pieces of information we can remember is probably about 3 to 4 chunks of information. And that's kind of what we do naturally to try and remember it somehow, is we put it together rather than keeping them as separate pieces of information when we've got quite a few. We also might have used association. So we've got here the picture of a supermarket. So sometimes people tell me that they can actually sort of envisage the aisles of the supermarket and think, right, I'd go down that aisle for the carrots, so that's where I would get that. And then I'd go down there to get the biscuits, and then there the milk and the turkey. So they might be using a bit of a combination there of visualization and association. But association can be a really helpful tool. If you remember earlier, I mentioned the pi symbol and maybe remembering the letter P because it's something we already know. If we can find a way of linking new information that we're teaching the children to something they already know about, then that really helps to build on those memory links, and will give them more chance of being able to remember it if we can help associate it with something. Or we can create associations by, for example, color coding information so that it's in a similar group because it's all yellow, or we've written it in a green font. So there's things we can do to support with that. And the final one that often people tell me that they are using is rhythm. So when they're doing the activity with the shopping list, people say, oh, you know, I was chanting through them, or I was getting a little song going to help me remember them. So that often happens. Some people do it naturally, or it's sometimes a strategy that is used in schools, particularly in the earlier years. So, for example, nursery rhymes and the alphabet are often things that are easy to remember because they've been put into a rhythm. So there might be ways that can be used in terms of new learning within the classroom to support with memory. And I've worked with lots of really fantastic dyslexic people, some of whom are absolutely brilliant at remembering lots of detailed song lyrics or dance routines, but really struggle with remembering the spelling of words and the reading patterns for words. But if you put that into some sort of rhythm, some sort of song, let them create that for themselves, it can be really beneficial sometimes. Now, it's also important to just note that a lot of dyslexic learners won't use these strategies without being shown how to use them. And that isn't always true, because sometimes I meet dyslexic learners who, even at quite a young age, are aware of their difficulties with memory and are beginning to develop strategies to help them overcome that. But often that doesn't happen naturally, and they need to be shown how to use them. That will also develop more over time. And the older a learner, typically the easier they will find it to use strategies, whether they've learned themselves or they're taught them. But that doesn't mean to say we can't teach younger learners too, because I have had lots of success with helping younger learners develop memory strategies. So as a class teacher, potentially you have the opportunity to model some of these strategies and be explicit about using them. So for example, you're talking to the class about, right, we're going to learn about some new information today. We're going to group it into this information, and this information. We're going to color code it, and that's a strategy to help us remember it. So being explicit and modeling can be helpful. And I would also say that as a school, if you've got learners who you know have got difficulties with their short-term working memory, it can be beneficial to give them some specific intervention on that as well, potentially. So I've noticed over the years, you know, that the demands of the curriculum and therefore the classroom, as they've built up, there's some of these kind of more core typical skills that have been left behind a bit. So for example, you know, we used to spend lots of time at carpet time up until even, you know, some of the younger years, doing general sort of listening activities, and lots of that's been removed because there's other things that have been brought in. So if you feel you can find some little pockets of time across the, you know, the school day to build in some little memory activities generally for your class, then you might find that that's a helpful strategy. Things that are very simple, like for example, the shopping list game, where we say we went to the shops and bought a loaf of bread, and the next person remembers that and adds on their own item. You know, a quick round of that or a couple of rounds of that during the day can help to build the memory skills. So there is ways we might be able to do that within the classroom quite quickly, but on a regular basis to build those skills up for all of the children, as well as the dyslexic children as well. So working memory, which we've sort of tested a little bit there with that activity, operates over just a few seconds. It's an active memory store. So it pays attention to information that comes in, and it helps us to switch between old information, long-term memory, and new information. So it is temporary storage, but it helps us to manipulate information. For example, if we were going to do a maths sum in our head, we're using our working memory to keep track of what we started with. We need to go into the long-term memory to figure out how we can solve that maths problem. What skills do we have? What knowledge do we have about those maths processes? And then we've got to keep track of what the answers are, what the new numbers are. So that's using our working memory. And if you've got a learner who's got difficulties with a skill like that, we would be encouraging them and showing them how to use, for example, more written workings out or more physical manipulatives with maths as the example there, so that they're not having to rely on their working memory as much. The working memory also helps us to focus attention. So if we've got difficulties with working memory, it can often lead to concentration challenges, us becoming really worn out because the working memory just can't keep track of it all and switching off. And that might be short little glimpses of distraction. It might be longer periods of zoning out. Okay, so what we're going to do next is a reading activity, which is going to put into play some of those cognitive skills and help us to illustrate some of that in terms of reading. So what I'm going to do is ask you to read the following text, and you're just going to have a fairly short amount of time to read through it. And then after we've all finished reading it, I will ask you for a little bit of feedback, and I'll give you a bit of instruction on what I want that to be when we finish reading it. So I'm going to show this on the screen, and then we'll move on afterwards to have a little bit of a discussion around it. Here is the text. Okay, so I'm going to take that down now and ask you, how did you do? So give me a little bit of feedback about how you got on. Did you find it easy, difficult, enjoyable, or not? Something else? Tell me what your thoughts on that. Okay, so I've got some people typing in the chat. I'm going to wait for those comments to come up. Vicky says she found it difficult. Lucy comments, I had to work out the rules first, like reading from the right to the left. Yep. So it was designed to be difficult. Yeah, you had to read backwards from right to left. Yeah, not something you're used to, so you've got to figure out a new process quickly. Somebody else commented it was enjoyable, but the longest words were very difficult. Yeah, and so what's often happening with the longest ones for people is your phonological awareness is jammed, isn't it? Because you're trying to put them together, but they're not in the right order. So you're having to sort of do that mentally in your head somehow, which so you're using that working memory, that phonological memory as well. Somebody else said they also struggled with the longer words, had to really concentrate, very challenging. Yeah, lots of focus, concentration needed for most people for that task. Absolutely. Somebody else has mentioned the words that were written backwards they could see, and often people comment on those small ones that are reversible as being the hardest for some people. So in there we've got know as on and was and saw, for example, and in those cases you're having to really retrain your brain because you just naturally automatically what those words are, so you're having to completely pause and rethink it. Yeah, so lots of challenges there for lots of reasons. As I say, your phonological memory is being really challenged when you're trying to decode those longer words. Your working memory is also being challenged. And also, it may not be for some people particularly enjoyable, might begin to get a bit frustrated. If we were having to read like that most of the time or quite a lot of the time during the day, we'd probably find us beginning to find it a bit frustrating, and therefore our enjoyment of reading might then diminish. And if I was now going to ask you, which I'm not going to ask you, some comprehension questions about that text, we'd probably find some difficulties with that. We'd probably feel we needed to read it at least another time in order to be able to get the answers we need, to get the understanding. So what a lot of people say is that we're just going through and decoding the words. We haven't got anything left really for understanding. We might have got a bit of a gist that there was something about a dog and a camp and some singing, but we haven't got a real understanding of what's going on. We'd need to go back through and try and find, reread and understand it more deeply if we were going to answer some questions about it. So as I say, what you're getting there is a glimpse into how it might be reading as a dyslexic individual. Not necessarily all the time, and not all dyslexic individuals will struggle to that level, but that certainly demonstrates some of those challenges that they may experience. So the last thing I'm going to talk about is speed of processing, which is again a typical difficulty that lots of dyslexic individuals will have, and this can impact in lots of different ways. Now, speed of processing does vary across all individuals. So some individuals need much more time for processing. Doesn't necessarily mean they're dyslexic, but we would look at that alongside some of the other things I've already talked about. Other individuals can process at a much faster speed. Speed of processing is not linked to intelligence. And I've met lots of very, very successful and intelligent dyslexic individuals who do need a lot more time for speed of processing, who need a lot more time for taking in new information and formulating their responses, whether sometimes that's verbally and sometimes it's in writing. It impacts people in different ways. It cannot be improved at a cognitive level. That's what the evidence tells us in terms of the research. So phonological awareness and phonological memory and short-term and working memory to some extent can be impacted by the right intervention. So we can, for example, we can do memory brain training activities to improve our memory skills. There's normally going to be a limit to how far we can increase that. So if we've got difficulties with short-term memory, we'll probably always have difficulties with short-term memory, but we might be able to boost it a little bit. And with the right specialist intervention, we can increase phonological awareness. If we do lots of work on sounds and listening to sounds and auditory discrimination and blending sounds together and so on, we may improve phonological awareness. And interestingly, in some of the schools I go into to assess, where they use certain programs of phonological awareness, or their staff are very well trained in delivering phonics sessions, and we can see a difference across the board with phonological awareness. So a lot of their learners that we assess will have difficulties across all the other areas, but their phonological awareness is not always as weak as what we find in other schools, for example. So it can quite interesting to see that we can see an impact there. Speed of processing, on the other hand, the evidence is that we can't improve that at cognitive level, at the brain level. So what that means is that it's really important for us to support that difficulty and find ways to adapt so that a dyslexic individual doesn't need as much time to process information, and there is things we can do to adapt that. Now, the image that's on here of a child learning to ride a bike is here because speed of processing we might consider, it varies across individuals and varies in terms of how much support people need with learning new skills. So when we learn to ride a bike, there's lots of different things we need to learn. So we need to learn to pedal, to brake, to steer. And then when we get older, we might be learning to use gears as well. So what we typically do when we're teaching a child to learn to ride a bike is we scaffold that process, we structure it, we support it. So often a bike with stabilisers is used first of all, so that the child doesn't have to learn to balance while they're learning the other parts. And then we go in step by step, we remove that level of support, those different scaffolds, as the child becomes ready and able. And obviously we give lots of support along the way. We might run alongside the bike. We're giving verbal praise, feedback to support as well in terms of whatever that child needs. Now, some children will need longer to learn to ride a bike than others, and some will be able to, remove those levels of support, that scaffolding at different speeds, at different paces. And that, I think, is, very similar to working with children in the classroom. So some will need more support with certain things than others, but it is important as well to think about when and how we start to remove that support so that they then become more independent in their learning and don't become too dependent or helpless in terms of being able to work on their own. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later on in terms of how we might achieve that. So speed of processing cannot be improved at a cognitive level. What we can think about is how we might adapt for that instead. And it's impacted, it varies according to how the language comes in and how the language goes out. So for a dyslexic learner, in terms of information coming in, they will typically need most time to process verbal information that comes in and that they're listening to. So we've often got difficulties with phonological awareness, phonological memory, and auditory short-term working memory. So anything that they're being taught verbally or being told verbally is probably going to be the thing they need most time to process. So if we can supplement that, if we can add to it some different ways of that information coming in, then they may help them to process it at a quicker speed. So for example, we often get lots of dyslexic learners who will tell us that they work really well in science where there's been demonstrations given, because the information is being explained verbally, but they can see it happening as well. And then they get a chance to try it out themselves on a practical level. But in terms of it coming in, there's a demonstration there, there's a visual. So if we can support the information we give with some sort of images, visuals, or practical demonstrations, it will often help with faster processing. And then the other thing that varies is in terms of how the information goes out. So how are we being asked for that child to give us their knowledge, to put the information back out. And typically, dyslexic learners will find the written output the hardest, the one that they need most time for. We often will find dyslexic learners are much stronger at verbally expressing their ideas, telling us their answers in spoken form. And quite often they're better with the physical as well, the practical hands-on application of their knowledge. So that means that we can consider how we might adapt what we ask them to do, what information we ask them to give us, how we ask them to demonstrate their knowledge. So for example, if we've been working through a new topic and we want to find out what the learners have remembered about it, what they've learnt. We might ask them to write their answers down in some question in a written format. So we give them some questions and we say, write down your answers. What do you know about this? Now, for some learners, that might be completely appropriate and they'll be able to work through that at a typical speed. For dyslexic learners, that will often be a lot harder and they'll need more time for it. And that obviously in the classroom is very difficult because we have a limited amount of time. Now, if what we're assessing is their knowledge of that topic as opposed to their writing skills, then what we could do is we could adapt for them by giving them, for example, a fillable form where there's words missing on the page and they write words in to demonstrate their knowledge as opposed to writing full sentences. And I would argue that that's a really fair and reasonable adaptation in the classroom to allow them to demonstrate the knowledge, but at the speed which suits the time you've got and the time you're giving them. And what that allows as well is it allows them to work independently, potentially, as opposed to needing help with the writing process or needing more time and therefore somebody having to sit with them while they finish their work. And just think about as well, the impact on them in terms of their self-esteem that on the back of that, if they feel they can do the task, yes, it's been adapted for them, but they can do it at the same speed as everyone else and they're allowed to get out to playtime and finish at the same time as everyone else, they will feel much more confident in themselves and happier typically. Okay, so we're going to do a writing task now, and this again will put into practice some of those skills that I've been talking about in terms of the difficulties a dyslexic individual might have. So what I'm going to do is dictate a passage to you, which I want you to write down. And as you write, I want you to draw a loop around every vowel as you write it. So for example, the word baby, the A would look like the @ symbol. But you're going to do that for every vowel that you come across. And what I want you to do is draw that loop around each vowel as you write it. So I don't want you to go back afterwards and loop the vowels when you finish the word or when you finish the sentence. I want you to do it in the moment, at the time, loop that vowel as we're working through that sentence. So I'm going to give you a short passage, which I want you to write down, and I'm going to deliver it at quite a quick pace to add a little bit of extra challenge there, okay? So I want you to write down the following. Working memory is how you keep track of several pieces of information via the short-term memory store. Your working memory allows you to solve problems and make connections. Okay, and when you get to the end of that, or to the point where you feel you've done as much as you can, I would like you to just give me a bit of feedback on that. How did you get on? How easy did you find it? And if you found it difficult, what was hard about it? Okay, so we've got a few people typing. I'll just wait for the comments to pop up and then I'll share them with everyone. Okay, so Natasha said, I found it very tricky. I completely missed the middle section as busy circling vowels. Yeah, often people say that they miss a chunk in the middle, then they kind of feel they can catch up a little bit at the end, but there's a bit missing. Yeah, somebody else said very similar. Focused on the vowels, lost the rest of the sentence, only ended up doing half. Yeah, so you've not managed to get it all down. Now, if I imagine that was I'm telling you what to do, I'm giving you the learning objectives for the lesson or the instructions for the lesson, you've missed half of it now. So what are you going to do now? Are you going to have to ask for help, or you're going to sit there and not know what you're doing, or ask your friend for help? I'm just waiting to see if we get any more top comments, any more feedback. A few people we haven't heard from much yet. I've got somebody else typing, so I'll just wait until that comment comes up and then we can feed it back. Oh, it's gone again now. Okay, so yes, the chances are you will have found that tricky. It was meant to be challenging. I'm asking you to do a completely new process, I would think. I would imagine you've probably not done anything like that before, or not that exact thing. So it's challenging your speed of processing because you're learning a new process. How quickly can you pick up that new process? How quickly can you learn it? You're also being challenged in terms of your memory skills. You're being challenged in terms of your short-term memory to hold on to what I've said. And also your working memory is being challenged because you're trying to remember as you go along which letters are vowels, and that requires your long-term memory to be involved. You're also trying to keep track of what's being said, and that challenges your working memory as well as your short-term memory. And bear in mind, if you've got any learners in your classroom for whom handwriting is not fluid yet, this is kind of what they're going to be doing all the time, isn't it? When they're writing, thinking, how do I write that letter? Because you haven't had to write letters like that before. So it's not natural, it's not automatic for you yet. So that's going to interrupt what you're doing as well. And the other thing to bear in mind is that what I'm doing there is dictating to you, which means you're not having to think about what you want to write. You've got to keep track of what I'm saying, but you're not having to think about what you want to write about. Now, if you were being asked to write your own sentence on top of that, it would become even more challenging because you've then got another element in there, which is creation of your own sentence, thinking that up for yourself as well. So that makes it extra hard. Creative writing brings in another element there. So there's lots of things going on in terms of the cognitive processing with that writing activity, which is fairly illustrative of how it might often be for a dyslexic learner in the classroom. So we quite often will see spelling mistakes because they're trying to focus on what they're meant to be writing or what they wanted to write. They haven't got anything left for spelling. They forget the spellings. Or they might be focusing so hard on spelling the words that the content diminishes of what they're writing, for example, or the amount of what they're writing diminishes. They're not able to write as quickly as other people. Now, bear in mind, I did go quite quickly, and that was to make it more of a challenge, so it's not too easy, but illustrating some of those difficulties. Obviously, if I was dictating to a learner, I would be considering going at a much more reasonable pace. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is just summarise those 4 key cognitive processing difficulties that we've run through, and then we're going to move on for our last section and talk about ways we might support on top of the things I've already sort of dipped into as we've gone through. So in terms of cognitive processing difficulties, we would often see a dyslexic learner will struggle with phonological awareness, making sense of sounds in letters and words. Phonological memory, so that's holding on to that sounds information and using it for tasks like blending sounds together when we're reading or putting sounds together in the right order for spelling. Verbal memory, in terms of short-term and working memory, will often be weaknesses, and we'll often see typically difficulty with processing speed. So what we've done is we've looked a little bit about how that might impact in the classroom. We've done some specific activities around reading and writing. But there's also some other ways that might impact. So I'm just going to run through those really quickly now, and then we're going to move on to strategies. So difficulties across dyslexia often impact reading, and we've had some exposure to that. So we often will see difficulties with reading speed as well as accuracy, typically quite often enjoyment and stamina. And you could see in that reading activity how it was hard, it took you time, might become a little bit frustrating, and therefore enjoyment tends to diminish, and your stamina for reading might too. Often we'll see difficulties with spelling, and then also difficulties with writing. And similar to reading, we might see challenges with speed of writing, accuracy, but also content. If the students are writing their own sentences, enjoyment and stamina are often impacted again as well. So we often meet lots of dyslexic learners who really, really dislike writing for all those reasons and find it very difficult. Also, we might find challenges with processing information and instructions, answering questions and work rate. So just generally how much work they can get through in the same space of time as their peers. How much time they need to answer a question is an important one. So often a learner with difficulties with processing speed and memory might well have the answers, but just need that extra time to think it through. So we're talking a few slides time about how we might support with that. And the other thing to bear in mind is that a lot of these challenges with the academic side of things and the processing information in the classroom will lead to emotional challenges, difficulties with mental well-being and self-esteem, confidence, so on, which I mentioned at the beginning we would touch upon, and we will as we go into our last section of the training in terms of how we can build up that ability to be independent within the classroom and develop self-esteem, confidence. And we would hope that that would have a positive impact on behaviour in the classroom as well. So for our final section, we're going to talk about how might we adapt our teaching practice so that dyslexic learners' cognitive difficulties are better supported. So that's specifically what we're trying to run through is those cognitive difficulties, what can we do to support them? We know that we can improve some of them if we do the right things, but typically we need to be looking at ways to adapt to work around those difficulties because they often don't receive that intervention support that they need to the level they need to actually improve them at a cognitive level. So what can we do to adapt and support? And the first thing we're going to talk about is how we can support working memory to free up and speed up processing. And if you remember, I said speed of processing, is the one that's the most difficult, or if not impossible, to impact at cognitive level. So just like we wouldn't ask a learner who was in a wheelchair to get up and walk, because we know they can't do that, we can't expect a learner to just be able to process more quickly. So we need to find ways to allow them to speed up that speed of processing. And freeing up the working memory can help with that. So I'm going to show you something which is called the Ebbinghaus forgetting curve. And this is the theory that humans start losing the memory of learned knowledge over time in a matter of minutes. And this is across all individuals, regardless of learning differences and regardless of age. The suggestion is that after 20 minutes, you can see here that we would have lost just over 40% of information that we've learned. So that's quite staggering in terms of how much information we're giving throughout the day and what's actually been retained. So this refers to information that is not reviewed, not actively reviewed, nothing's being done with it actively. So we need to impact on that somehow. And what we can do is we can use something called spaced review, which is perfect for quick forgetters. And spaced review, some people find, is a little bit similar to things like maths mastery because it has stages to it throughout the lesson. The suggestion here is that we can use this for other topics as well. And what you might feel as well is that you do some reviews across the lesson, you build in review points, but what I get a lot of teachers telling me is that this is a reminder that they need to do it probably more often than what they're doing, and they maybe need to think about being a bit more systematic with it. So it's not sort of an occasional, right, how are we getting on, what can we remember? It's more formally built into the lesson plan. So I'm going to talk about why that works. Spaced review helps to consolidate the learning at a much deeper level, and it also helps to highlight any problems or misconceptions. So what it is giving you is regular feedback on the impact your teaching is having. And you'll see how that plays out when I give you some examples in a minute. The ideal space between each review point depends on the attention span of the class or the individual. So just ask you a quick question to consider for yourself. What do you think the typical attention span of a 9-year-old would be? And you should have a figure in your head. There is a simple formula you can use for this to help you out, which is attention span equals chronicle age plus 2. So the typical attention span of a 9-year-old will be 11 minutes. And bear in mind, this doesn't include those with attention concentration difficulties or working memory difficulties like dyslexic children. This is typical. So a dyslexic learner might well have a shorter attention span than this. And you might feel that you notice some of your learners can concentrate and have a longer attention span than that. And that may appear that that's the case. But the research tells us that beyond that figure, it becomes the information that's retained starts to reduce. So although they might look like they're concentrating and taking the information in, they might take in bits of it, they're probably not going to be very effective beyond that point in time. So we want to keep that as a rough guide in terms of how frequently we add in these review activities. So, for example, the basic lesson structure for a 9-year-old would look like beginning with a demonstration of mastery from the previous lesson. So that means reminding the learners what we did and demonstrating what that looks like when it's being done accurately, correctly. And then for a 9-year-old, roughly every 11 minutes, we're going to inject a quick assessment for learning activity, a formative assessment activity to check what impact we're having. And the feedback from these activities is what determines the direction of the lesson for the class and or individuals. So you might be noticing at each review point that everybody is on understanding and they seem to be really clicking with it, and we can just keep moving on as we planned. But you might find that some individuals need more time, so they're not understanding it and they need a bit more support. Now, that might be where you think this is something that they really need extra help with. This is going to have to take place outside of this session. We're going to have to do it separately from the classroom. Or it could be that most of the class are not picking it up at the speed you thought, in which case you might want to adapt what you're doing. So that does mean that this way of teaching is quite high energy. It's quite high commitment. It means that we're teaching the pupils rather than the lesson. So we're not just moving through our lesson plan because it's what we wrote down and what we plan to do. We are adapting what we're doing to suit what is being learned, what is being understood. And the reason that works is because it is slowing down that forgetting curve. So each time we do an active review point, we're pushing that information into the long-term memory. We're helping it to be retained in the long term rather than being forgotten. And what we mean by these review points, and I'll give you some examples in a minute, is really quick, quite short activities. So I'm not talking about making your lesson longer, somehow magically finding more time. We're talking about building in these really quick, short activities. And although sometimes, we might feel like we haven't got even time for that within what we're trying to get through, the benefits outweigh that slight use of time, because the research shows us that over time, much more information will be retained. So you might think, but I need to get through all this, but then in a few weeks' time, you come back to the topic and there's been 50% of it's been forgotten. We're going to have to catch up somehow, or there's going to be gaps in the learner's knowledge. So this will add in a little bit of time, very little bits of time, but it will mean that more information is learned and you should have less gaps. So whether that's for you as a teacher, or whether it's in intervention sessions, or whether it's teacher in the following year, it should mean that there's less gaps in learning. So what I'm going to do now is just give you some examples of some possible review points that you might use at different stages of the lesson and what might be appropriate. These are just suggestions, and they're for you to take and adapt and develop and be creative with in terms of what works for you and what works for you in terms of whatever topics you're going through, whatever you're working through. So some suggestions here. First one, review point 1. At the beginning of the lesson, we might want to check out what do we remember from last time in terms of this topic. So we might get the learners to tell their neighbour. So we might ask a question. So for example, tell me 3 important things we did yesterday in this topic. Give a little bit of thinking time and then ask them to tell their neighbour as a way of articulating their thoughts, what they remember. You could add into this in terms of making it a bit more hands-on visual for those learners that will benefit from that and allowing to support their speed of processing. So for example, they could use post-it notes that they add their ideas onto quickly and then collect them up. Or we could have some cards out with some topics to support some fact finding, and they go and match them up to show that they can remember that how that information fits together. So that would be a chance for you to find out what did they remember from last session, and immediately, do I progress with my plan or do I need to adapt a little bit? And I did speak to a teacher recently who shared with me the example of a maths lesson that she'd done. She went back to revisit the same topic the following week and found that her learners pretty much hadn't picked it up at all, and there was very little remembered. So she had to very quickly decide, right, that lesson plan is not going to be delivered today. I'm going to have to adapt and think on the spot and do something different. We also can use visuals or notes to prompt from what we did last time. And I'll show you as we go through these 4 suggestion points, we can make it a little bit of a cycle. So I'll show you how we can do that. So then we're going to do some input. We're going to talk about the new topic. We're going to teach some information. And then we want to stop again after whatever time is appropriate for the age of you learners and check the learning. So we're a little bit deeper into the new topic. We want to find out what are they learning about it now? How is it sitting? How is it landing? So something you could do to check that learning is bouncing. So we could bounce the answer around the room to build understanding, develop stronger reasoning. So what that means is that we're going to ask a question. We're going to pause, give a little bit of processing time, and then we're either pounce on somebody to give them an answer, or we might do a tell your neighbour to find a good answer. Now, what you want to do here is be quite careful about your questions and who you ask, and think about your learners. So ideally, if you're going to start with an answer out loud for the class, you want that to be somebody who you know generally tends to pick it up quite well and quite accurately. So we start with an accurate answer, and then we can build on that. So if we've got a learner who we know needs a bit more time for processing and finds it a bit harder to come up with their own ideas straight away, then we might ask them to build on somebody else's idea instead. We might say, right, well, Jack had a really good answer there. Sarah, what would you add to that to make it an even better answer? So they're not having to do the full thing for themselves from the beginning. And we also, in order to allow for that speed of processing and help to support some of the anxiety that might be experienced around that, we could do some preparing. So it might be, Sarah, I'm going to come to you in a minute. So listen to Jack and think about what you can add to it to give a bit of extra time processing. Then we're going to do a bit more input. We're going to add some more information in. We're going to teach them more about the topic. And then at review point 3, we might want to check the impact. So what impact is this really having now? How are these individual learners actually understanding what we're doing? So here we want to give them a chance to articulate their thinking before answering, because we want to know what individually they know. And that means that we need to give them time to have a think about that a bit more on their own. So then we're going to get them to share their answer somehow. So it could be at this point that we've got a fillable form and they're going to fill in some words to show what they know. Or it could be that we have got some sentences that are chopped up into the beginning of the sentence and the end of the sentence, and that we want them to match them up so that they can show their knowledge in terms of how those facts are adding up or the topic is building up in their minds. So it doesn't always have to be them coming up with the answers from scratch. It could be that we're supporting that, scaffolding it. And if we do something like that where we're using words or sentences, then we can adapt that according to the reading skills of the group. So if we know we've got learners who have got a lower reading age, then we can give them more simplified sentences and facts to allow them to take part in the same activity and process it at the same speed as other people who can read more complex pieces of text. Then we're going to do a little bit more giving information. Then finally, at the end of the session, we want to do a bit of a summary. And typically, I would imagine this is the review point that you will do most of the time. You probably do the first one, a little bit of an introduction, reminder of what we did last time, and then we do a summary. But this is just a suggestion of how you might do it that would support those dyslexic learners. So we might try and summarise that topic in 3 short, quick captions. And then we might repeat that by reducing it down to 3 words. And remember, in terms of memory difficulties, repetition is good. So repeating it, but also making that information shorter might be helpful. And then if you can, depending on the topic and how easy this is, you might reduce it down to one word so that it's really simplified and you've got a real, really simple piece of information there for them to come back to. And then we might add a visual for a hook, add some sort of image or some sort of activity that we've done as the visual hook for next time. And that was where I talked about that loop. So then next time when we say, what did we do last time? We might show the image and the keyword that we got that down to. Or if it was 3 words, we might show those 3 keywords or some sort of visuals that represent those keywords as a prompt, a reminder to hook back into where that information is in the long-term memory. So that is a little bit of an introduction to spaced review and how you might use that in your learning to support those learners with speedy processing and working memory difficulties. And then next up, what I'm going to do is talk through another strategy, which is called directed discovery teaching. Now, when you were younger and you got taught about secondary colours, you were probably given the chance to experiment to find out about them. So your teacher might have said, here's some paints mixed together, red and blue. What do we get? That's called purple. Or they might have shown you the final colour, for example, green, and said, I want you to mix colours together and see how you come up with green. So what we're doing there is they're allowing you to experiment, but to come up with the answer that they know you will come up with. So it's predicted, it's directive. They know what you want you to come up with, but it's directed and you're allowed to experiment to find out for yourself. So in that way, you're giving the learner control over finding out that information. You're doing it in a structured way, you're directing them to the answer, but you're doing it in a way that allows them to have control of that. And that helps to develop their independence. It allows them to discover that new learning for themselves in a scaffolded way. And it's really good at getting the information from the short term to the long term memory and also helping them to get it back out, because it's a much more active form of learning. It gets them to engage their brains and think about the problem for themselves. How can I solve this problem? How I'm going to come up with this answer? Typically, it's engaging because it's fun and it encourages independence. So rather than them being told by the teacher, this is X and this is Y and this is Z, they're going to find out how to get to that answer for themselves, and that develops their independence, their confidence in their own abilities to learn. So in terms of examples of that, we might, in a foreign language or learning new terminology or new topic words in English or geography, for example, science, we might ask them to match up words and pictures, or match up facts with words, facts with pictures, as a way of finding out information for themselves. I mentioned earlier on the example of having sentences chopped up. We might also teach spelling via directed discovery teaching. So, for example, contracted words or other spelling rules. And what I'm going to do with you now is just very quickly run through an example of that in terms of a spelling rule, so you can sort of see how that might play out and what it actually would look like. So what we've got here is the double letter rule. And the resource that you can see on the screen at the moment is actually, you can see, is from Twinkle, but I thought it was quite a nice one because it mentions the floss, which is not as popular now as it was at one point, but still probably well known by quite a few children, is a really nice example of that association. So teaching something new by associating with something they already know, so there's a link there. If they know what the floss is, they will be made potentially more likely to remember this if it's taught like this. And you could also do a bit of getting active and moving around and chat, a bit of rhythm and building that into it to build in some of those other memory strategies. So what I want to just show you is how we would introduce the double letter rule using directed discovery teaching, essentially by asking questions and using a few visual resources. So what we can see on the screen here is we've got the teacher on the left and the pupil on the right. And the teacher says, repeat these words after me: tot, los, mos. And and the learner repeats those words. Then the teacher asks, what sound can you hear is the same in these words? And hopefully the learner recognises that it's the sound that's the same. Now, obviously, they might vary in terms of how easy or difficult they find that, and you might need to support with that. We might need to overemphasize that sound in the words to hopefully get them to it, but at some point we'd hope that they would get to recognising that. Then we ask, where in the word does that sound come? And hopefully they would be able to recognise that it's the end of a word. Again, might need some support, but they get there hopefully. And then the next question, how many syllables do the words have? And the answer in this case is 1. And obviously that would be dependent on their ability to count syllables. So we might pick up at that point that they need help with that and have to look at that separately, or we'd need to check beforehand that they can definitely do that. And now what can you see is the same in the words. So we're going to show them the words and hopefully they would recognise that they all have double S, and we might get them to underline that or highlight it somehow to really put that into practice to see it played out on paper. So what we've done through that is we're teaching them the double consonant rule, the double letter rule, which is that a word has a double S at the end if the sound is at the end and if the word has 1 syllable. And that's a sort of very slightly simplified version of that rule just to demonstrate this mode of teaching. But hopefully it helps you to see how we can get a learner to the final answer, but without giving them that information straight away. We're getting them to discover it with that clever questioning, with some of the resources along the way. And the chances are that that will make it more memorable and also means they're more likely to understand it than if we simply just tell them, right, these letters have a double S because the sound's at the end and they've got 1 syllable. It's going to be much more likely that they're going to put that into the long-term memory and be able to retrieve it. So moving on, that's just a couple of sort of general strategies that you might try out. I want to talk about a few specific skills that I can give you some advice for, and then we're going to finish this evening's session. So in terms of writing, I've already mentioned that, really high cognitive demand involved in writing. So we need to somehow reduce that cognitive load for those dyslexic learners. So we might use visual methods. So we might use mind maps or topic ideas to plan their work first. Lots of dyslexic learners will be really overwhelmed by a blank sheet of paper and find it really hard to just transfer their ideas straight down on there. And remember that visual side of their brain is typically stronger. They're going to have that creative ideas side if we allow them to express it. So, for example, allowing them on a blank piece of paper to write their ideas in bubbles, or having some sort of visual for them to fill in might allow them to plan their ideas better. And then they've got a guide, they've got something beside them they can use to write their ideas up. We also might use things like typing or speech to text software to allow them to write their ideas, and that can often help to reduce the cognitive load. We also might allow them to do things like recording their ideas onto a sound button or something, because for a lot of dyslexic learners, the challenge is remembering their ideas when they've vocalized them. So they've verbalized an idea, a sentence they want to write, but then when they come to write it, because of those challenges with memory and writing and spelling and so on, they forget what they wanted to write and it comes out as a much more simplified version. And then I already mentioned earlier on things like fillable worksheets. You also might have sentence starters and so on for those that need a bit of help with getting started with writing, as well as the actual speed at which they can write. So here we've got a couple of examples of some visual organisers. I'm sure you've seen some examples of things like this. You maybe use things like this already. On the left, we've got a writing plan. On the right, we've got a story, spider graph. So different types of writing there being supported with a visual in slightly different ways. We also, in terms of writing, might help to reduce the cognitive load by reducing the expectations around how much we ask them to write. Or we might give more time, which, as I know, and as I've said before, it is a challenge in the classroom, but there might be ways we can do that. I would also advise that we consider the purpose of copying. So is it really necessary, or can we give them that information on a sheet in front of them to use, rather than having to get behind with copying at the start of a lesson and still already feel like they're kind of behind and not doing as well as everyone else. Typical one is the date, for example, and so some learners will be able to copy that down really quickly and simply. Other learners will find that really challenging and need more time for it. And as I say, it might set them back. So could they have a stamp where they stamp the date in the book? Do they need to write the date every time? We also might consider the use of alternative forms of evidence of knowledge. So I mentioned fillable forms, but for example, we might ask as a requirement for a question for some learners or all learners, we might say, I want you to draw a diagram to demonstrate your knowledge of this topic. And that links quite well to the modern world of work, because in the modern world of work now, we're not always asked to write down our answers in full sentences. We often use different forms of mapping out our ideas or showing our knowledge. And then also a few things that I would suggest in terms of reading to support with that. So first of all, allow adequate time, and that might seem fairly obvious, but it's not always that easy to implement, or it might be something we forget about. So the reading activity we did hopefully gives you an insight into how much extra time is often needed for reading. So can we think about how much time we give for that, and or give materials in advance? So is it possible to pre-teach some of those keywords, or give a passage in advance of that session so a learner has got a bit of extra time to go over it? I would also recommend that we look at how we can break the text up and show students how to do this. So something as simple as having a piece of card that they put over the text to make it so it's less, so it's more manageable, smaller chunks to go through, can be really effective. Dyslexic learners are often quite overwhelmed by big chunks of text. So that is a really useful strategy that we can show them, and then they can use for themselves moving forwards in their learning to be independent with that, to help with that. We would also potentially be helpful to teach skimming and scanning skills if we don't already have that factored in. And alongside that, potentially the use of highlighters and coloured pens to help organise information and keep track of information. And then also consider the use of assistive technology in terms of electronic reader pens. And that's something that if anyone's interested in, we can give more information on in terms of what they look like, how you access them and how they're used. Ensure materials are accessible. So you can see here we've got information about Buckingham Palace, a text about it, and it's presented in two quite different ways. The piece on the right is spread out much more. It's much clearer font. We've got some use of bold words there to help it easier to go through and pick out that information. So just consider what you're giving the learners to read through and make sure they're accessible. And then finally, what I want to do is just finish off by talking a little bit about memory before we go on to our final few thoughts. And a lot of this is about what we covered earlier. So make a conscious effort. In terms of what I mean there is ask your learners to make a conscious effort. So when I told you that you had to remember some information, the shopping list, you probably were very switched on to thinking, right, I need to remember this. So alert your learners that you want them to remember something and get them to be ready for that. Think about using some of those strategies that I mentioned earlier and teaching them. And also use things like coloured pens to help organise information in the brain, categorise it, allow it to be more easily retrieved from the long-term memory. And then in terms of giving instructions, a few pieces of guidance here. So make sure you break instructions down into smaller steps and they're not too complex. Think about how much information you're giving at one time. Signpost the giving of instructions. So for example, I'm going to give you 3 instructions now, and I want you to repeat after me and follow on my fingers as we repeat them. So there's a visual hook there as to remembering those instructions. And then depending on the age of your learners, you might reinforce them in writing or use things like visual graphic organisers to have them to refer back to. And then finally, just very generally, I would say, as I've touched on already, consider how you enable independent working and therefore confidence. So things like matching activities, self-checking, or having an individual learning aid notebook can help to allow the learner to become more independent and therefore confident in their learning. And the reason why I've mentioned having an individual learning aid notebook for everyone is so that we recognise that all learners have strengths and weaknesses. It's not just the dyslexic learners that need that extra help. We all have things that we might need to remind ourselves about or think about at certain times. And it's sort of cultivating that culture of acceptance that we have things that support us, strategies that support us. And again, building those strategies for moving forwards in education as well. So, final thoughts from me and a question before we finish. You have an important part to play in helping these young people become successful in the future. You also can support emotion and raise confidence. So how will you do it? And what I'd like you to do, just take 2 minutes before you go to write down what you're going to be taking away from today. So think about that on your own and then make some notes. And I've got the image of a starting gun here to represent the start of a race. Hopefully this training session has inspired you to think about these things and sort of kickstart or reignite your interest in thinking about dyslexia and your teaching practice. But to get to the end of the race, you're going to have to put some effort in yourselves, build up your stamina, practice, trial and error, see what works. I'm always here if anyone wants to ask any questions. You're welcome to get in touch. But you need to do some of that stuff yourself, okay? So I'll give you 2 minutes to think about what you're taking away from today. And then after that, I will send through a review form for you to complete, which I really appreciate if you complete, give me some feedback, and also some additional resources for you to have a look at. Okay, I'll let you get on with that.